In the shadowed halls of Madrid's royal palace, on September 29, 1833, a king lay dying, his body a rotting testament to a life drowned in depravity. Ferdinand VII, once Spain's proud monarch, was now a pitiful figure, consumed by syphilis, his flesh marred by oozing sores, his groans a haunting requiem for a reign soaked in shame. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the courtiers who once trembled at his name now recoiled in disgust. This was no noble end for a king. It was the final act of a man who had turned a crown into a curse, a throne into a stage for unspeakable perversions. How did a prince, born to lead a great empire, become the most despised and debauched ruler in Spanish history? Step back to 1784, into a court festering with scandal, where a young Ferdinand's twisted desires were nurtured by a world of betrayal and vice. From torturing animals as a child to spying on courtiers' most intimate moments, his darkness grew unchecked. As king, he wielded power not to govern but to prey, transforming the palace into a den of coercion and cruelty. His wives Maria Antonia, Isabel, Maria Josepha fell one by one, broken by his sadistic whims, their deaths shrouded in whispers of poison and despair. Spain crumbled as he indulged, colonies lost, the economy shattered, while he orchestrated orgies and blackmailed the innocent. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, a predator cloaked in royal robes, whose legacy of lust and tyranny left a nation in ruins. Dare to uncover the sordid truth of a king who sold his soul and his kingdom for the fleeting thrill of depravity. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Depravity. The air in Madrid's royal palace was heavy with secrets, a labyrinth of whispers and shadows, where power and betrayal danced in a sinister waltz. In the autumn of 1784, a child was born into this den of intrigue, a boy destined to wear the crown of Spain, yet fated to tarnish it with blood and shame. Ferdinand, son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, entered the world not with the promise of greatness, but with a darkness that would fester in the opulent halls of the Spanish court. The opening act of his life, as foretold by the grim spectacle of his death in 1833, was no tale of valor, but a prelude to a reign that would plunge a nation into despair. From his earliest days, Ferdinand was no ordinary prince. The court, a gilded cage of decadence, was a breeding ground for vice, and the young heir absorbed its poison like a sponge. His mother, Maria Louisa, was infamous for her brazen affairs, none more scandalous than her entanglement with Manuel Godoy, a cunning opportunist who held the reins of Spain through her bedchamber. The Queen's indiscretions were no secret. Courtiers whispered of her late-night trysts, her laughter echoing through the palace as Charles IV, weak and oblivious, turned a blind eye. It was in this moral quagmire that Ferdinand's character took shape, molded by a world where loyalty was a currency spent on pleasure and power. By the age of 10, the prince's cruelty was already a topic of hushed alarm. Servants recounted chilling tales of his games, cats strung up in the palace gardens, their tortured cries met with his gleeful laughter. He tormented footmen, forcing them to perform humiliating acts for his amusement, his small hands wielding a whip with unsettling precision. Tutors, tasked with shaping a future king, found themselves powerless against his defiance. Those who dared to discipline him were dismissed, their warnings ignored by a royal family too entangled in their own vices to notice the monster growing in their midst. Ferdinand's education, meant to forge a statesman, was a farce. He scoffed at books, sneered at art, and dismissed matters of state as beneath him. His only passion was voyeurism, a perverse curiosity that led him to order secret holes drilled into the walls of palace chambers, through which he spied on courtiers' private moments, his young mind intoxicated by the forbidden. The court, complicit in its silence, enabled his descent. Maria Louisa, indulgent and distracted, saw her son's antics as mere childish rebellion, while Charles IV, a king in name only, was too feeble to intervene. The palace became Ferdinand's playground, a place where his impulses went unchecked, his cruelty cloaked in royal privilege. By his teenage years, his obsession with power over others had deepened, taking a darker turn. He began to manipulate those around him, using his status to coerce and intimidate. Ladies in waiting, young and vulnerable, caught his eye, their fear a thrill he savored. Whispers spread of maids summoned to his chambers under the guise of service, only to emerge pale and trembling, their silence bought with threats against their families. In 1802, at the age of 18, Ferdinand was thrust into a marriage meant to tame his wild spirit. Maria Antonia of Naples, his cousin, was a delicate, pious princess, her education steeped in the virtues of faith and duty. The court hoped she would civilize the wayward prince, but the union was a descent into hell. Behind closed doors, Ferdinand subjected her to depraved demands, his desires twisted by a need to dominate and degrade. Maria Antonia, barely out of girlhood, was ill-equipped to withstand his brutality. Court diaries, penned in secret, spoke of her tear-streaked face, her once bright spirit dimmed by shame. She withdrew from public life, retreating to her chambers, where she lived in near seclusion, avoiding the husband who saw her not as a wife, but as a vessel for his perversions. Her health withered, and in 1806, at just 21, she died under a cloud of suspicion. Official reports cited tuberculosis, but whispers of poison lingered, fueled by the king's chilling indifference. She was dull, Ferdinand remarked coldly, already casting his gaze toward new conquests. The death of Maria Antonia marked a turning point, unshackling Ferdinand from even the pretense of restraint. His position as heir gave him unchecked power, and he wielded it like a blade. He developed a particular fixation on married women, viewing their seduction as a conquest not just of their bodies, but of their husbands' honor. Nobles, desperate to maintain favor, swallowed their pride as their wives were summoned to the prince's chambers. Those who resisted found their families ruined, their titles stripped, or their reputations smeared by fabricated scandals. Ferdinand's blackmail was methodical, his threats delivered with a serpent's smile. The court became a theater of degradation, where loyalty was bartered for survival, and virtue was a luxury few could afford. His depravity was not limited to the palace. Ferdinand's appetites extended to the streets of Madrid, where he sought out prostitutes and vulnerable young women, his royal guards ensuring his indiscretions remained hidden. These encounters, however, came at a cost. By his early 20s, he had contracted his first venereal disease, a secret kept from the public but known to the court physicians who treated him in hushed urgency. The infection, a precursor to the syphilis that would later destroy him, did nothing to curb his excesses. If anything, it emboldened him, as if defying fate itself. The political turmoil of the era only deepened the chaos of Ferdinand's world. In 1808, Napoleon's invasion of Spain threw the nation into crisis, forcing Charles IV's abdication during the Aranjuez Mutiny. Ferdinand, now king, had a chance to prove himself a leader, to rally his people against a foreign tyrant. Instead, he revealed a cowardice that shocked even his enemies. At the Bayonne meeting with Napoleon, he grovelled, offering Spain's submission in exchange for personal safety. French accounts described him as a snivelling figure, his dignity sacrificed for promises of luxury. Napoleon, no stranger to spineless monarchs, called him the vilest creature to ever sit a throne. Exiled to the Château de Valençay, Ferdinand lived not as a prisoner, but as a pampered guest, indulging in lavish feasts and sordid affairs, while Spain bled under French occupation. Letters intercepted by French spies revealed his insatiable demands for female entertainment, his indifference to his people's suffering, a betrayal as profound as any military defeat. In these years of exile, Ferdinand's depravity reached new depths. He corrupted French servants, organized orgies with fellow exiles, and sank further into a mire of vice. The palace at Valençay became a grotesque mirror of the Madrid court, a place where his darkest impulses flourished without restraint. Yet, even as he revelled, the seeds of his downfall were sown. The diseases he contracted in his reckless pursuits began to take hold, their symptoms a grim foreshadowing of the agony that awaited him. Back in Spain, the people clung to the hope that their desired one, as Ferdinand was briefly called, would return to save them. Little did they know that the man they awaited was no savior but a predator, his heart as rotten as the empire he would inherit. When he returned in 1814, it was not to restore Spain's glory, but to tighten the chains of tyranny and indulgence. The stage was set for a reign that would make his early sins pale in comparison, a reign that would cement his legacy as the most perverted king in Spanish history. This was only the beginning. Ferdinand's story, like a festering wound, would grow uglier with time, each act of debauchery a nail in the coffin of a once great nation. The boy who tortured cats had become a man who tortured souls, and Spain would pay the price for his descent into darkness. Chapter 2. The Throne of Tyranny and Vice. The year 1814 marked Ferdinand VII's return to Spain, a moment that should have heralded a new dawn for a nation battered by Napoleonic occupation. Instead, it was the beginning of a reign that would plunge Spain deeper into darkness, as the prince who had grovelled before Napoleon now ascended the throne as a king cloaked in malice. The court of Madrid, already tainted by the scandals of his youth, became a stage for Ferdinand's unbridled depravity, his crown a tool to indulge desires that grew ever more monstrous. The boy who once spied through palace walls had become a man who ruled through fear and lust, his reign a grotesque continuation of the perversions that defined his early years. Ferdinand's restoration was met with fleeting hope. The Spanish people, weary from years of war and occupation, dubbed him El Deseado, the desired one, clinging to the illusion of a savior king. But the man who returned was no hero. The cowardice he displayed at Bayonne had hardened into a ruthless ambition to wield absolute power, not for the nation's good, but for his own gratification. His first act as king set the tone. He abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, a document born of Spain's resistance to Napoleon, and restored the absolute monarchy. The move was not driven by principle, but by a desire to eliminate any check on his authority. Ferdinand saw the throne not as a responsibility, but as a license to dominate, and he would use it to feed his darkest impulses. The Spanish court, already a cesspool of intrigue, became a veritable den of iniquity under Ferdinand's rule. He re-established the Inquisition, not out of religious zeal, but as a weapon to terrorize and extort. The tribunals, cloaked in the guise of piety, became tools of blackmail, their shadow looming over noble families who dared resist the king's demands. Ferdinand's obsession with control extended to the most intimate spheres of court life. He revived the perverse practices of his youth, but now with the full might of the crown behind him. Ladies-in-waiting, once vulnerable to his adolescent whims, were now systematically targeted, coerced into his chambers with threats of ruin. The king's lust was insatiable, his appetite for married women a particular fixation. He reveled in the power of humiliating noblemen, forcing them to offer their wives or daughters to secure favor or avoid disgrace. Whispers of these transactions filled the palace, a currency of shame that bought loyalty and silenced dissent. Ferdinand's second marriage in 1816 to Isabel of Braganza, a Portuguese princess of only 19, was a grim echo of his first. The court hoped the union would temper his excesses, but Isabel, like Maria Antonia before her, became a victim of his cruelty. Secret diaries from the period paint a harrowing picture, a young woman subjected to sadistic rituals, her spirit crushed under the weight of her husband's depravity. Ferdinand's chambers became a theatre of degradation, where he orchestrated scenes of humiliation, forcing Isabel to endure acts that shocked even the jaded courtiers. Her health deteriorated rapidly, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a hollow gaze. In 1818, at just 22, Isabel died, her body bearing marks of trauma that physicians could not fully explain. The official report cited illness, but the court buzzed with rumors of abuse so severe it hastened her end. Ferdinand's response was chillingly callous. "She served her purpose," he remarked, already planning his next conquest. The king's depravity extended beyond the palace walls. He prowled Madrid's underbelly, seeking out prostitutes and vulnerable women, his royal guards ensuring his escapades remained hidden from public view. These encounters, however, carried a mounting toll. The venereal diseases that had plagued him in exile worsened, their symptoms a constant reminder of his reckless indulgences. Yet, rather than restrain himself, Ferdinand grew bolder, as if daring fate to claim him. Court physicians, sworn to secrecy, struggled to manage his condition, their treatments a futile attempt to stem the rot spreading through his body. Ferdinand's reign was not only a moral catastrophe, but a political disaster. While he indulged in vice, Spain's empire crumbled. The American colonies, inspired by the winds of independence, broke away one by one, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, leaving Spain a hollow shell of its former glory. The economy, already battered by war, collapsed under mismanagement and corruption. Ferdinand, oblivious to the crisis, surrounded himself with sycophants chosen not for competence, but for their willingness to enable his desires. Ministerial posts were awarded to men who offered their wives or daughters, turning the government into a brothel masquerading as a court. The king's informal harem, a network of women officially titled as ladies-in-waiting, was an open secret, their presence a constant reminder of his unchecked power. The Inquisition, under Ferdinand's command, became a grotesque extension of his perversions. He used accusations of heresy to target enemies and coerce women, offering clemency in exchange for sexual favors. Nuns, once protected by their vows, were not spared. Ferdinand's agents scoured convents, identifying those who could be blackmailed or bribed. Secret reports, uncovered centuries later, revealed his obsession with virgins, whom he pursued with a predator's zeal, offering gold to desperate families in exchange for their daughters. These acts were not mere indulgences, but displays of dominance, each conquest a testament to his absolute control. By the 1820s, Ferdinand's depravity had reached its zenith. He orchestrated orgies within the palace, transforming royal banquets into spectacles of debauchery. Courtiers were forced to participate or watch, their complicity ensuring their silence. The king's sadistic streak grew more pronounced. He delighted in rituals that humiliated his victims, turning intimacy into a public performance for his amusement. These acts, documented in coded letters by horrified attendants, shocked even the lax standards of the era. The court, once a symbol of Spanish grandeur, had become a house of horrors, its halls echoing with the cries of the broken and the betrayed. Ferdinand's third marriage to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony in 1819 was yet another tragedy. The 20-year-old princess, devout and innocent, was delivered to a king whose body and soul were already decaying. Her tenure as queen was brief and brutal, marked by the same abuse that had claimed her predecessors. She died in 1821, her death shrouded in mystery, with whispers of physical and psychological torment. Ferdinand's indifference was stark. Within months, he was plotting his next marriage, his appetite undimmed by the trail of bodies left in his wake. As Spain spiraled into chaos, Ferdinand remained detached, his focus fixed on his pleasures. The liberal uprisings of 1820, which briefly forced him to reinstate the constitution, were a fleeting challenge to his tyranny. He crushed the movement with ruthless efficiency, using foreign troops to restore his absolute rule. The executions and purges that followed were less about politics than about asserting his dominance, a reminder that no one could defy him. Yet, even as he tightened his grip, the nation slipped further from his grasp. The treasury was empty, the colonies were gone, and the people, once hopeful, now despised the king who had betrayed them. Ferdinand's final marriage in 1829 to Maria Cristina of Bourbon Two Sicilies was a desperate bid for an heir. By then, the king was a shadow of himself, his body ravaged by disease, his mind fraying under the weight of syphilis. Maria Cristina, at 23, endured a marriage marked by his waning but still cruel desires. She outlived him, but only because his illness had rendered him too weak to inflict the full extent of his former horrors. The court, once vibrant with intrigue, now whispered of the king's decline, his once terrifying presence reduced to a pitiful spectacle. The seeds of depravity sown in Ferdinand's youth had grown into a poisonous vine, choking the life from Spain. His reign, a continuation of the darkness that defined his early years, was a masterclass in corruption, each act of vice a brick in the wall of his infamy. As the 1820s drew to a close, the nation stood on the brink of collapse, its king a hollow figure whose lust had consumed not only himself but the empire he was meant to lead. The stage was set for his final, wretched act, a death that would mirror the life he had chosen, alone and despised, a fitting end for a king who had turned a throne into a monument to sin. Chapter 3. The Abyss of Power. The year 1823 marked a turning point for Ferdinand VII, but not toward redemption. Having crushed the liberal uprising of 1820 with the aid of foreign troops, he tightened his iron grip on Spain, transforming the throne into a grotesque altar for his depravity. The court of Madrid, already a cesspool of vice under his reign, descended into an abyss where power and perversion intertwined, each feeding the other in a relentless cycle of corruption. The king, who had once cowered before Napoleon, now ruled as a tyrant, his desires unchecked, his cruelty boundless. The horrors of his youth and early reign, chronicled in the shadowed whispers of Chapter 2, were but a prelude to the depths he would plumb as Spain's empire crumbled, and his own body began its slow betrayal. Ferdinand's restoration of absolute monarchy after the liberal triennium was a declaration of war on any semblance of restraint. The Constitution of 1812, briefly revived, was obliterated, its supporters hunted down with merciless precision. The Inquisition, revitalized as his personal instrument of terror, cast a long shadow over the nation. But this was no holy crusade. It was a perverse machinery of extortion, designed to feed Ferdinand's insatiable appetites. Nobles who dared resist his demands found their families accused of heresy, their titles stripped, their daughters or wives summoned to the palace under thinly veiled threats. The tribunals became a grotesque extension of his lust, a means to coerce submission from women who would otherwise recoil from his touch. Secret reports from the era, hidden in dusty archives, reveal a chilling pattern. Accusations of blasphemy or witchcraft leveled against families, only to be dropped after a private audience with the king, the price paid in shame and silence. The palace itself had become a labyrinth of debauchery, its opulent chambers transformed into stages for Ferdinand's darkest fantasies. The informal harem of ladies-in-waiting, established in his early reign, grew into an institution of horror. These women, often young and from impoverished, noble families, were trapped in a cycle of coercion, their service to the king a euphemism for servitude of the most degrading kind. Ferdinand's obsession with humiliating rituals reached new heights. He orchestrated spectacles where his victims were forced into acts of submission before select courtiers, their degradation a twisted display of his power. These scenes, described in coded letters by horrified attendants, were not mere indulgences, but deliberate performances, designed to assert his dominance over both his victims and those who witnessed their fall. The court, once a beacon of Spanish grandeur, had become a house of depravity, its halls echoing with the stifled sobs of the broken. Ferdinand's fixation on virgins, noted in his earlier years, grew into a monstrous compulsion. He offered gold and favors to desperate families, trading their daughters' innocence for promises of wealth or protection. Convents, once sanctuaries of faith, were not spared. The king's agents scoured religious houses, identifying nuns vulnerable to blackmail or coercion. Those who resisted faced accusations of heresy, their vows shattered under the weight of royal threats. One chilling account, penned by a confessor who later fled Spain, described a young nun forced to renounce her faith in a private audience with the king, her screams ignored as courtiers turned away. Ferdinand's depravity knew no bounds. His pursuit of the pure was not just a desire, but a desecration, a deliberate affront to the sanctity he claimed to uphold as defender of the faith. His personal life mirrored the chaos of his rule. In 1829, Ferdinand married his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of Bourbon-II Sicilies, a 23-year-old princess whose youth and beauty were a stark contrast to the king's decaying form. By then, the syphilis contracted in his reckless youth had begun to ravage his body, its symptoms no longer concealable. His skin was marred by sores, his movements labored, his mind increasingly erratic. Yet even in his decline, Ferdinand's cruelty persisted. Maria Cristina, unlike her predecessors, survived the marriage, largely because the king's physical deterioration limited his capacity for abuse. But she was not spared his malice. Court records hint at her enduring psychological torment, her role as queen, a facade masking a life of quiet dread. Her survival was a testament not to love, but to endurance, a grim necessity to secure an heir for a throne stained by blood and vice. While Ferdinand indulged, Spain bled. The American colonies, once the backbone of the empire, continued their exodus, with Chile, Bolivia, and others declaring independence. The treasury, drained by war and mismanagement, was a hollow shell, its coffers looted by corrupt officials hand-picked by the king for their complicity in his schemes. The economy collapsed, markets stagnated, and famine crept into the countryside. The Spanish people, who had once hailed Ferdinand as their savior, now cursed his name, their hope replaced by despair. The king, however, remained oblivious, his world confined to the palace's gilded walls, where he orchestrated his perverse entertainments while the nation crumbled. The court's moral decay was matched by its political rot. Ferdinand's ministers were chosen not for competence, but for their willingness to enable his desires. Positions of power were bartered for access to family members, a transaction so normalized that it became a grotesque currency of governance. One noble, whose wife had caught the king's eye, was elevated to a high office only to be discarded when his spouse resisted. Another, more compliant, saw his daughter appointed as a lady-in-waiting, her fate sealed in a single night. These arrangements, whispered about in darkened corridors, were a public secret, the court's complicity a testament to Ferdinand's absolute control. Even the clergy, once guardians of morality, were drawn into the mire, with bishops turning a blind eye to the king's sins in exchange for favor or fear of retribution. Ferdinand's physical decline, however, began to cast a shadow over his reign. The syphilis that had simmered in his body for years now manifested in grotesque clarity. His once handsome features were distorted by ulcers, his speech slurred by neurological decay. Court physicians, bound by oath, worked tirelessly to conceal the truth, but the king's condition was impossible to hide. Visitors to the palace noted the stench that clung to him, the labored breaths that punctuated his rare public appearances. Yet even as his body failed, his appetite for control remained. He issued decrees with increasing paranoia, targeting perceived enemies with ruthless purges. The Inquisition, now a shadow of its former power, was wielded as a blunt instrument, its tribunals a stage for settling personal scores and securing new victims. The Spanish people, suffering under famine and oppression, began to see their king for what he was, not a monarch, but a predator. Ballads and pamphlets, circulated in secret, mocked his debauchery, their crude verses a rebellion against his tyranny. The court, too, grew restless, its members torn between fear and disgust. Those who had once enabled Ferdinand's excesses began to distance themselves, their loyalty eroded by the king's deteriorating state. The palace, once alive with intrigue, now felt like a tomb, its air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. As the 1820s drew to a close, Ferdinand's reign stood as a monument to ruin. The empire he inherited, once a titan of the world, was a fractured remnant, its colonies lost, its people broken. The king, consumed by his own vices, was a walking corpse, his body a mirror of the nation he had ravaged. The horrors of his early years, the betrayals of his exile, and the tyranny of his restoration had culminated in a reign that was less a government than a prolonged act of desecration. Maria Christina, pregnant with the future Isabel II, was the last hope for a dynasty tainted by her husband's sins. But even she could not escape the shadow of his legacy. Ferdinand's story was nearing its end, but not before one final act of degradation. The king, who had turned a throne into a brothel, a nation into a wasteland, would face a reckoning not in the courts of men, but in the merciless judgment of his own body. The seeds of his depravity, sown in youth and nurtured through power, had grown into a poison that would consume him, leaving Spain to grapple with the wreckage of his reign. The abyss of power had claimed its master, but the cost would be borne by a nation forever scarred by his name. Chapter 4. The Final Descent. By 1829, Ferdinand VII's reign had become a grotesque parody of monarchy, a carnival of vice that had drained Spain of its vitality. The king, once a figure of dread, was now a decaying relic, his body ravaged by the syphilis that had festered since his reckless youth. The Palace of Madrid, described in Chapter 3 as a labyrinth of debauchery, had grown silent, its opulent halls haunted by the echoes of a nation's ruin. The man who had wielded absolute power to feed his perverse desires now faced the consequences of a life spent in defiance of morality and duty. Yet, even as his body crumbled, Ferdinand's grip on power remained, his final years a grim testament to the depths of his depravity and the toll it exacted on Spain. The marriage to Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies in 1829, as noted in the chronicles of his reign, was a desperate bid to secure an heir. At 45, Ferdinand was a shadow of the predatory prince who had terrorized his earlier wives. His skin was a patchwork of oozing sores, his movements slow and pained, his mind clouded by the neurological ravages of his disease. Maria Cristina, a vibrant 23-year-old, entered this union not as a bride but as a pawn in a dynastic game, her family trading her to a king whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. Unlike Maria Antonia, Isabel, and Maria Josefa, whose lives were cut short by his brutality, Maria Cristina's youth and Ferdinand's physical decline spared her the worst of his abuses. Yet she was not unscathed. Court whispers spoke of her enduring his erratic rages and degrading demands, her role as queen a daily exercise in survival. Her pregnancy, which would produce the future Isabel II, was a flicker of hope in a court shrouded in despair, but it came at the cost of living in the shadow of a monster. Ferdinand's physical decay did little to curb his appetite for control. Though his body faltered, his paranoia and malice grew sharper, fueled by the disease that gnawed at his brain. The Inquisition, already a tool of his perverse ambitions, became even more ruthless in his final years. He used it to settle scores, targeting nobles who had dared to distance themselves from his decaying court. Families were torn apart by accusations of treason or heresy, their women summoned to the palace as offerings to appease a king whose desires, though diminished, remained twisted. One chilling account from a courtier's journal described a young noblewoman, barely 16, forced to perform in one of Ferdinand's degrading spectacles, her family's lands restored only after her compliance. These acts, though less frequent as his health failed, were a stark reminder that the king's cruelty endured even as his body betrayed him. The palace, once a stage for Ferdinand's orgies, had become a place of dread. The courtiers who had enabled his vices in earlier years now avoided him, repelled by the stench of his wounds and the spectre of his madness. The informal harem that had once thrived under his command dwindled, its members either dead, fled, or discarded when they ceased to amuse him. The king's obsession with virgins and nuns, a hallmark of his reign, persisted in grotesque parody. He sent agents to scour the countryside, offering gold to impoverished families for their daughters. But these pursuits grew sporadic, his body too weak to enact the full scope of his former horrors. Instead, he turned inward, his paranoia manifesting in fits of rage against imagined enemies. Servants whispered of nights when the king, half mad, roamed the palace, shouting curses at shadows, his once terrifying presence reduced to a pathetic caricature. Spain, meanwhile, continued its descent into chaos. The loss of the American colonies, nearly complete by 1830, had gutted the empire's wealth and prestige. Mexico, Peru, and others had slipped away, their independence a direct rebuke to Ferdinand's misrule. The economy, already crippled, collapsed further under the weight of corruption and neglect. Famine gripped the countryside, and cities like Madrid and Seville teemed with unrest. The people, who had once called Ferdinand El Deseado, now spat his name, their suffering a direct result of his indifference. Ballads circulated in secret, mocking the king as a lecherous tyrant, his crown a symbol not of glory, but of shame. Yet Ferdinand remained oblivious, his world confined to the palace, where he clung to the illusion of power even as his body betrayed him. The court's decay mirrored the nation's. Ministers, chosen for their complicity in Ferdinand's schemes, plundered what remained of the treasury, their loyalty bought with the promise of wealth or the fear of retribution. The clergy, once a moral counterweight, had been corrupted or cowed, their silence a testament to the king's stranglehold on power. Even the military, once a pillar of Spanish might, was riddled with corruption, its officers more concerned with securing favor than defending the nation. The palace, a microcosm of Spain's ruin, was a place of hushed fear, its opulence a mocking contrast to the poverty beyond its walls. Ferdinand's final years were a prolonged agony, a fitting punishment for a life of vice. The syphilis that had simmered for decades now consumed him, its symptoms a grotesque mirror of his moral decay. His skin was a map of ulcers, his joints swollen, his speech a slurred mockery of royal command. Court physicians, bound by duty, tended to him in secret, their treatments a futile attempt to delay the inevitable. The king's public appearances grew rare, his condition too shameful to display. When he did emerge, wrapped in heavy robes to conceal his ravaged body, his presence inspired not awe, but pity and disgust. Visitors to the court noted the stench that clung to him, the labored breaths that punctuated his words. The man who had once terrorized Spain was now a prisoner of his own body, his power a hollow shell. As 1833 dawned, Ferdinand's decline accelerated. His mind, eroded by disease, veered between lucidity and madness. He issued erratic decrees, purging courtiers on whims and demanding impossible tributes from a bankrupt nation. Maria Cristina, now mother to the infant Isabel, navigated the court with cautious precision, her role as regent looming as Ferdinand's life faded. The king's former victims, those who had survived his reign, had long since fled or died, their absence a silent condemnation. The courtiers who remained attended him out of obligation, their faces masks of feigned loyalty. The palace, once alive with the buzz of intrigue, was now a tomb, its silence broken only by the king's pained groans. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII breathed his last, his death a release for a nation exhausted by his tyranny. The royal chambers, once a stage for his depravity, were filled with the stench of decay, his body a testament to the wages of sin. No tears were shed at his passing. The court and the people felt only relief, a collective exhale as the shadow of his reign lifted. His daughter, Isabel II, inherited a throne stained by her father's crimes, a kingdom fractured and impoverished. The funeral was a perfunctory affair, the pomp of royalty overshadowed by the weight of his infamy. Ferdinand's legacy was one of ruin. In 20 years, He had transformed Spain from a great power into a backwater, its colonies lost, its economy shattered, its people broken. His obsession with carnal pleasures had cost the nation its dignity, his abuse of power a stain that would linger for generations. The court he left behind was a husk, its nobles complicit, its honor tarnished. Isabel II, a child of 3, faced a daunting task, her reign burdened by the sins of her father. The lessons of Ferdinand's reign are stark. Absolute power, unchecked by morality or accountability, corrupts absolutely, turning a man into a monster and a nation into a wasteland. His story is a warning to the present, a reminder that leadership demands virtue, not vice. The voices of his victims, silenced in life, echo through history, demanding justice and vigilance. Ferdinand VII, the king who sold his soul for pleasure, died as he lived alone, despised and damned by his own choices. Spain, scarred but enduring, would rise from his ashes, a testament to the resilience of a people betrayed by their king.